The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Brian Townsend. I am one of Lexion's digital media artists. And today we're going to be talking about working with textures inside KeyShot. And we still have a few people trickling in, so we'll go ahead and wait a little while until we get rolling here. And while we wait, one thing I do want to mention is that part of this webinar throughout today will be spent inside of Photoshop because one of the goals of today is to help you become more self-reliant as far as creating textures that are custom to your projects. We try to provide materials and textures that are useful to you, but naturally in some cases, if you're creating a piece of furniture that has a specific wood grain, and you have the ability to take a picture or scan reference of that and turn it into a texture, that's going to make your final project that much more powerful than if you use, say, a stock wood material that we ship with KeyShot. Okay, seems like the room is filling up pretty good here. So I'll go ahead and start out with giving you an overview of what we're going to cover today. The webinar is going to be 3 parts that we do cover within this hour time frame. And so part 1 is going to be texture basics. So as I mentioned, we want to try to make you guys more self-reliant and be able to create custom textures and materials for your projects so that you can more closely recreate what exactly it is you're trying to design. We'll talk about techniques when photographing textures for creating your own. We'll talk about online resources. And we'll talk about the difference between tiled versus non-tiled textures. And we'll talk about bump maps, normal maps, what the difference is between the two, and also how to create your own. And part 2 of today's webinar, many of you might have seen the still life image from the newsletter. What we're going to do is actually go through creating the materials and textures for this scene, as well as setting up the lighting and talk about some concepts to keep in mind for overall creating a more powerful looking image. What we're going to do is we're going to create a seamless wood texture and bump map. So in other words, when I say seamless, you'll be able to repeat that texture without the appearance of tiling. We're going to create a material for the bowl, and we're going to use a bump map to add a higher level of realism through subtle imperfections on the surface of the metal. We're going to go through creating that orange texture and bump map, and also I want to mention that that orange is the translucent material, which is one of our newer material types. So we'll talk about some of the things you'll want to keep in mind when using textures on the translucent material. The other thing I want to talk about is this vase back here. You can see those lines that cut across the actual structure back there. And that's entirely done with a normal map. That's not geometry at all. And I'll show you how flexible it is to control the angle of those, to increase or decrease the intensity of the height, and so on and so forth. Next, we will introduce a new lighting environment that we're going to make available to you at the end of this webinar. And also, we're going to talk about creating a backplate from an HDRI. So this may work to your advantage in a couple cases. One, maybe the backplates that you have available for a certain HDRI that you want to use don't quite suit your needs, or maybe the HDRI that you have doesn't include a backplate. So I'm going to show you a little trick that you can do using KeyShot to create your own custom backplate. And part 3, we're actually going to make some changes to this scene after we have it all set up and created to improve the dynamic range. Many of you might have seen the gamma property inside KeyShot and wondered what exactly that is or what it's used for. So we'll go ahead and cover that a little bit. One of the things that it's really important for is, like I said, improving the dynamic range. So these highlights and things like you see on the spoon or in this gold ring here, or the shadows underneath this bowl, what we're really going to do is increase the tonal range so that certain areas aren't so blown out, and you'll be able to retain detail in these really dark and really light areas. Part of that involves modifying the textures, so I'll show you how to do that. Then we'll go ahead and reset up our scene with the new settings. We'll save out the image, and then we'll compare the images from the initial setup to the final setup where we actually improved our dynamic range. Now, one thing I do also want to emphasize is this last part of the webinar is not something that's really necessary to be able to create good or realistic images out of KeyShot, but it is something that if you understand what gamma is and what it's used for, it will help take your images to the next level. And at the end of the webinar, we'll go ahead and open it up for a questions and answer period. And one thing I do want to mention about that is we do have a lot of people in the webinar today, so unfortunately we won't be able to answer every single question that comes through. And if we don't get to yours, you can always send an email to support@luxion.com. And the same team that organizes the webinars and presents these and shows you these tips and tricks are the same ones that answer your support emails. So if you ever have a question about how to pull off a certain look or create a certain material, you're always free to email us at support@luxion.com. All right, so having said that, we'll go ahead and get started. And with that, we'll start out with talking about creating your own textures. Now, there's a couple ways of getting textures into the computer. One is photographing, and one is scanning. Photographing comes into play when you can't exactly fit texture into your scanner. I mean, if you have a wood bench out in public somewhere, it's obviously not going to be realistic or feasible to go bring that into your workspace and scan that. So you might have to rely on photographs. Now, it doesn't require any special fancy camera to be able to photograph your own textures, but one thing you want to take into account is it's best to photograph textures outdoors on cloudy days. That way you don't have sharp shadows cutting across your textures and creating artificial lighting situations. Also, it makes the lighting on whatever is you're photographing even, so you don't have areas that are really highlighted and areas that are real dark. So that's ideal to take into account when you're photographing textures. The other method is scanning, and scanning is, I think, the better method whenever you have the option to do so, and that's because your overall lighting will be pretty even from the scanner. Okay, now if either of those aren't an option for you, there's a fantastic online resource that I want to show you, and it's called cgtextures.com, and we'll actually be using some textures from this site today. So we'll go ahead and pull that up, and I'll show you what it is, how it's organized, and why it's so great. One of the factors is all these textures are extremely high quality. The other is you as designers working on professional projects and professional work don't have to worry about licensing issues with these textures. They're available for professional projects free of charge. If you just set up a free account and you have a 15 megabyte daily quota, and you can use these textures on all the projects you want free of charge. Like I said, they're all very high quality and incredibly organized. So if you know what you're looking for example, if you want wood, you can click here, and then there's all sorts of different wood types available. Today we'll be using an example from the rough woods. And as you can see, there's just a ton of stuff available here for you as a resource. Okay, so next one thing I want to talk about is the difference between tiled and non-tiled textures. Here in CG Textures, you will see some of these say tiled. Others might not say tiled, and I'll go ahead and show you what that means here. And I'll start by opening up a scene. And for these two material balls, I'm going to go ahead and assign a texture to one that is tiled, and to the other material ball, I'll assign a texture that is not. So right here I have this metal texture. I'll go ahead and apply that. And this one is actually tiled. So I'll double click on the other material back here, and we'll apply a texture to it. And this one, let's see. And if we reduce the scale, okay, this one here is the tile texture, so you don't see any seams that are repeated. This one here is not tiled, so you can see these sharp edges and these sharp lines, and that's because it hasn't been set up to be repeated without any seams. And I'm going to show you how to go ahead and set up textures that aren't already prepped like this so that you can repeat them. Another thing I do want to point out, though, is even with tiled textures, just by the nature of the fact that you are repeating a texture, as you drop the scale down, eventually you will see some level of repetition. But if you're only, repeating a texture a couple, 3-4 times, it's not bad, and certainly leaps and bounds better than what you see here with these sharp seams. Okay, so let's jump into Photoshop. And what I'm going to do is show you how to take this tiled or non-tiled texture and actually make it so that you can repeat it without seeing those seams. Okay, so I'll go ahead and open up that file. All right, so it's already not tiled. Okay, now the first step in this is using the offset tool in Photoshop, and that's found under the filter menu. So if we go to filter, other, offset, and then we have these horizontal and vertical sliders here. Now let me explain to you what happened here. Basically we took the edges of these images, top, bottom, side, and we flipped them inward. So essentially the edges now became the middle of the picture, and the reason for that is the middle of the picture already does not have any seams. So if we can make this middle portion, the edges, we know that it'll repeat. So again, filter, other, offset. Now the values you set here aren't necessarily too critical as long as you can see the vertical and horizontal seam. Now next what we'll do, I want to talk to you about the clone tool. That's this tool found over here. And I'm going to go ahead and increase my brush size. You can also do that by using the bracket keys. Okay. Now the first step in using the clone tool is you want to take a picture of a certain area of pixels. So if I hover my brush over this area and I hold Alt and click, that essentially takes a picture of those pixels. Now you can see if I hover over this seam, it shows me when I click what's going to happen. So I can start to clean up this seam and fix that issue. And so I'll just go ahead and do this very quick. So remember, Alt to take picture of a certain area, Alt left click, and then just left click to start painting. And you'll want to sample from different areas of the picture so that your results seem varied and not too repeated. Also, you can turn down the opacity of your brush up here with the opacity slider to get a more even transition in areas of high contrast. So, this will be incredibly useful for you, especially, like I said, if you're photographing your own textures, like if you photograph a wood grain for a piece of furniture that you've designed or a plastic texture that you want to use. To be able to repeat that, you'll want to go through these steps. After I clean up the seams, I want to go ahead and just do an offset one other time. because sometimes you'll see additional seams after it goes through that. So there's one right there. We'll clean that up real quick, and then we've just created a seamless texture. So I'll save this out and we'll load it in. Call this metal seamless. And if we go back into KeyShot, where we once had these seams, I'll load this texture that we just modified. Here it is, metal seamless, and the seams are gone. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is bump maps versus normal maps. Now, for those of you who have seen this under the bump map tab, and this is found under the material properties, which you can access by double-clicking a material anywhere on the model at any point in time. Under the bump map tab, you can load an image for the bump, and you also have this normal map option here. And I'll show you two examples really quick of what a bump map is and what a normal map is, just to sort of explain that to you. If we go to textures. Okay, now a bump map uses black and white values to determine areas of raised and lowered. Okay, so what this is going to do is this is going to simulate subtle details on a model that isn't necessarily realistic to model. So I'll go ahead and load that particular image as a bump map, and you'll see what happens. Okay, so if we look on here, we can sort of see these circular areas of depression. Let me change the material type here to make it more apparent. So I went to a plastic, so we'll actually see some specular highlights and reflections. And if I click on that bump map, I can control the scale of the bump by using these sliders. And so that will repeat this texture even further. Okay. Now with bump maps, like I said, it's black and white values. So basically you have one dimension, either raised or lowered. With normal maps, we have a lot more colors in the normal map, and each one of these actually have an XYZ coordinate. So you're able to talk about depth in 3 different dimensions as opposed to just one, either raised or lowered. So with normal maps, generally you'll be able to get a little bit more detail out of your bump, but again, they're not really critical. You can still achieve very effective results with simple black and white images. So on that note, I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and start with a wood texture that we're going to use in our still life scene. We're going to go ahead and make it seamless, and then we're going to go ahead and create a bump map from that seamless texture so that we can use it to add depth to our material. Okay, now beforehand I already found an image that I thought would be good to use. So, and again, this came from CG Textures. Okay, so we'll open this up in Photoshop. And again, just like before, we're going to use that offset tool so we can start making this seamless. So we'll go to Filter, Other, Offset, and so we can see our seam right there. Again, that took the edges of the image and it flipped them inward so that the center of the image now became the edges, and now that we know that it will repeat seamlessly. You'll notice that we don't really see a horizontal seam, and the reason for that with this particular case is that wood grain runs horizontally, so that really worked out in our favor. So now that we've offset it, select my clone tool, and I'm going to take a picture of this area of the image by holding Alt, Shift left clicking, and starting to paint. And as you do this more, you'll get pretty good at it. At first, it may take a little bit of trial and error, but remember to always sample different areas of the image. Before every brush stroke, I pretty much click in a different area so that I'm not repeating and cloning the same exact thing over and over. Okay, so we've essentially made that wood seamless. So let's save it out. We'll call it wood seamless. And let's load it onto one of our material balls here. For the wood, we're going to go ahead and use a diffuse material type. Diffuse by nature does not have any reflections or specular highlights, which is pretty ideal for what we're trying to create. So I'll go ahead and load that in. Here's our seamless wood texture, and as you can see, we can scale it. And the only thing we really see is what was in that natural wood grain. There was that strip of grain that ran the full length of the texture. So that might actually sort of serve it or act as a seam. So in a case like that, you might want to actually break up that with some other variation using the clone tool. Okay, next, let's just create a bump map from our seamless texture. Since it is seamless, we know that the bump map will also repeat correctly. First thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer so that we save our color map without altering it. So I'll do that by clicking here in the layers palette, and I'm going to drag and drop that down onto the new layer button. The next thing I'm going to do is desaturate this image because bump maps rely on black and white values. And I'll also just go ahead and bump up the contrast slightly so that these areas act as, more depressed, where the deeper grain is. Now another thing you can do, if you look here, see this area is almost white, so that'll almost act as a very raised area, which that's not necessarily the case. It was actually, just some stain or something on the wood that happens to be brighter. So I'll show you one quick technique if you want to just isolate the dark areas to bring those out as bumps. And that's through the Select menu, and you go to Select Color Range, and that pulls up this little dialog box here. And this shows a black and white preview of our image. And if I click this little eyedropper tool on the dark wood grain, that's going to start to select pixels that have this value. I can hold Shift to expand the selection and click on other areas. So what that did is essentially selected all the dark areas in the image, and if I go back to my layers and press Ctrl J, what I've done is copied all the dark areas from the underlying layer to a new layer. If I create a layer underneath that and fill it with 50% gray, now all I have is that bump information from the wood grain. Now we're not worried about this stain on the wood surface here actually being interpreted as an area that's more raised. What I'll do though is I will probably increase the brightness of this 50% gray just so we have a little bit more contrast between the bump and the raised areas. Okay, and now I'll save this out as our wood bump. Okay, so let's load this onto our model and see what we come out with. Okay, so now we are starting to create that illusion of depth just through this black and white image. Now, you notice in the previous step what we did is we did adjust the scale of our texture. Now, KeyShot has a really great feature when working with textures to make sure that your bump and color maps line up automatically. And that's this sync checkbox right here. If I check that and then readjust my scale, since those are the same images, it's applying the same exact scale to those and they line up perfectly. So now I don't have to adjust those properties in two separate tabs separately. Under the bump map tab, we can control the height or the actual influence of that bump map on our material. Go ahead and make this window bigger so you can see. All right. And if we use this height slider here, we can interactively see the effect that the bump map has. And you can use negative values as well. So that's producing a pretty good realistic look. I'll go ahead and disable the bump map really quick so you can see the effect that that has on the material. So under the bump map tab, if I uncheck this enable box, you can see that's, it's a subtle difference, but it's enough that it does add, a higher level of realism to that material. Okay, so since we've gone and created this material, I'll go ahead and save this out for use in creating and texturing our still life scene. And to do that, I'll pull up the materials dialog. And for those of you who are fairly new to KeyShot, inside the material library, you can sort by group. So if you know what you're looking for, whether it's a metal, liquid, glass, etc., you can sort by that type. I'll go ahead and save this in the woods. And I'm going to do that by right-clicking on the material and hit Add Material to Library. This pulls up the dialog box here, and what I'll do is I'll select the group wood, and I will call this rough wood. Press OK. So there's our rough wood, and it saved all the parameters that we had set up. So if we drag and drop this onto the other material ball, we should have the same exact material. And you can see there it is. Okay, so that's a look at creating seamless textures, creating bump maps to go along with them, and actually implementing them and modifying them inside of KeyShot. Next, like I said, we'll go ahead and move on to the still life scene. I'll import that model and we'll start texturing it up and adjusting the lighting. One thing also that I might not have mentioned at the beginning of the webinar is that we will be providing that scene to you as reference. So if there's something you didn't quite catch during the webinar, you can always open up that scene, pull up material properties, and take a look and see what's really going on to create that look. So go ahead and import the model. Okay, so here's the still life scene. Nothing too exciting yet, but we'll change that here really quick. I'll go ahead and start with some of the basic materials before we get into some of the ones that we're going to actually texture. And I'll start with the wine glass here. As most of you know, and probably a lot of the reason that you decided to purchase KeyShot and use it in your workflow is it's incredibly easy and it's incredibly fast. So what I'll do is I'll go to my material library, I'll change the group over to a glass, and I'll just drag and drop a clear glass on top of that wine glass. Already pretty realistic look. One thing I do want to point out is you see these black areas in the wine glass, and you can see this black area under here that doesn't quite look realistic. I'll explain to you why that is, and we can find the answer to that under the Options tab. And once we pull up the options, if we go over to the Real-Time tab, there's two things we need to take into account to fix this. One is ray bounces. Now, ray bounces are the number of times that a ray of light is calculated as it bounces around a scene. And so, for example, this glass right here, it has an outer layer. It has the inner portion that defines the inner layer of glass. It has another inner layer when you get to the other side of glass, and then it has an outer layer on that side. So essentially we have 1, 2, 3, 4 bounces to see completely through this glass. If I turn this down to 4, that's just enough to see through the glass. If we go to 3, notice that becomes black. But The great thing is, even if this concept seems a bit complex and difficult to understand, is to decide what the number is that you need. Since KeyShot's so interactive, all you have to do is adjust this slider. And when you get to a look that looks good to you, and if you are increasing this value and you don't notice any change in the look of the model, then you don't need to increase that value any higher. Now, we did increase this to 26 and we still have this dark area here. The reason for that is by default this detailed indirect illumination option is not checked. If we check that, that allows light to pass through transparent objects and illuminate geometry underneath. Okay, moving on. We'll go ahead and drag and drop a material onto this ring. In the image it was a gold ring, so we'll go ahead and use that. In the materials group, we'll go ahead and go down to precious metals. One thing also I want to mention is that all materials inside KeyShot are scientifically accurate. They're all physically based off of real-world properties, and any of the ones that we've set up for you have actual properties of those materials. So 24 karat gold all the way down to 10 karat gold will render accurately for you. And same with the rose gold, the silver, platinum, and so on and so forth. So we'll go ahead and go with 24 karat gold, and we'll drag and drop this onto the ring. And again, super easy. And remember from before, we set up our wood material already, so we have that in the wood group. Drag and drop rough wood. And let's go ahead and assign a metal to this bowl. I'll create this just from scratch instead of pulling from the library to show you another method of creating materials. If I double click on it, as most of you know, that pulls up the properties. By default, when the models come in, they're set to an advanced material. I'll change this from advanced over to metal, and I'll change the color from blue just to a gray tone so we get something more like chrome. Okay, we'll let this sit for a second, and I'm going to go ahead and point out some things that we can do to make this metal material look more realistic. Oftentimes in CG, a dead giveaway that something is fake is it looks too perfect. So right now, as you can see, we have this perfectly reflective metal. There's no imperfections on this surface whatsoever. Now we can fix that in a couple different ways. One is adding roughness. So as we increase this value, what that's doing is it's adding microscopic levels of imperfections to this surface so that light isn't perfectly reflected. It's scattered across the surface somewhat before actually coming back to the eye, which actually makes these reflections not look so perfectly sharp. Now that's great, it's fast, it's a quick, easy fix to add a level of imperfection. But one thing about it is it's incredibly even in the way it distributes those imperfections. So if we supplement this with a bump map, we can take that level of imperfection to a higher level. So what we'll do, go over to the bump map tab, and I'll load in an image. And this is an image that actually ships with KeyShot. For those of you who are not familiar with the KeyShot directory structure, it is an important concept to understand. Inside your documents library on PC, it's found in the KeyShot folder. And then in there, we have a textures folder, and you can see your textures. And in there, there's a bunch of these that already ship with KeyShot. And what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and pull in one that already ships with the software, and that's this cast iron bump. Okay. And also, for those of you who are Mac users, the KeyShot resources folder is found in Library, Application Support, KeyShot folder on the system level. Okay, so I just loaded in this cast iron bump. So now we have really two things acting on this bowl that are creating those imperfections. We've got the surface roughness that we applied under the material parameters, and we have this bump map, which again, remember bump maps use black and white values to determine areas of raised and lowered surfaces. Now, the scale of this is a bit high and the effect is a bit intense. One thing I want to show you, while you're actually setting up your textures, you can enter performance mode by pressing Alt-P. That basically automatically drops the KeyShot real-time render settings down to something that's low quality so that you can actually quickly and easily adjust scale, rotation, other parameters of textures without having to fully calculate a photorealistic scene. So it's a more efficient way of working. Okay, now one thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and drop the scale of this bump map. So I'll do so by clicking the scale slider and moving that down. And that's going to essentially repeat this image. This is a seamless texture, by the way. And we're going to get smaller levels of imperfection. Also, it's still a bit intense, so I'm going to go ahead and drop the height down as well. I think in this case, subtlety is key. So let's zoom out here and we'll let that render, and we'll see the difference with the bump map and without it, so you can see how that does add a nice level of realism to it. I just turned off performance mode by pressing Alt-P. And so as that renders, you can see, now these reflections, it's not perfectly smooth, and it does have a nice level of imperfection to it. Let me disable the bump map really quick so you can compare sort of the before and after we applied that. So as I mentioned, with just the material parameter surface roughness, the imperfections are distributed very evenly. So if you want to add a bit more distress to that, you can apply a bump map like we just did. Okay, let's go ahead and set up the base material back here. I'll show you another very cool and effective way of using bump and normal maps to add more visual interest and realism to your scene. So again, I'm not going to start with material from the library. I'm just going to double click on here, which pulls up the material properties. And again, I'm going to change this from advanced over to metal. And I'm going to change the color from blue over to a gray. Okay, now again, one of the questions that came in, I'm just going to stop for a second so I can answer this, is do you need to convert a bump map to black and white or grayscale, or will KeyShot convert a color bump map internally to black and white? And the answer is yes, it will convert that. It will look at those color values and will essentially determine where those lie on a grayscale, and will interpret that as bump. I do sort of recommend converting to grayscale first. That way, if you want to increase the contrast of your image to more accentuate the bump depth, you can do so inside Photoshop. Okay, so back to this vase here. Again, we're facing the same issue as we were with the bowl, and that it's too perfect. So first, I'll go ahead and double-click on the material. And again, we'll just add a subtle level of roughness this time. Nothing too intense. I do kind of want this to be a more polished and reflective surface than the bowl. And the great thing is with KeyShot and this roughness parameter, you can adjust it in very, very subtle increments. So you can just add the slightest levels of imperfection. It does give you 3 decimal places to work with. So if you want a value of 0.001, you can enter that, and that'll be your most subtle level of imperfection that you can achieve. And as with everything in KeyShot, the slider is a very great way to work because it will give you an interactive preview of what that parameter adjustment is going to do to your material. All right, so let's go ahead and introduce a bump map onto here. And this time I'm going to use a normal map. And I'm going to use one that already ships with KeyShot. And it's this horizontal tubes normal. Now, when you do load in a normal map, you do need to check this normal map box. Okay. Now, the height is a bit extreme on this, so I'll drop that down. And also, the scale is a bit extreme. So as I lower this, this texture will be repeated, and we'll get more fine lines. across that material. Okay. Now, one great thing about this is I can control the angle. Now, some of you might remember that or some of you might remember from the life image that these these lines were sort of at an angle on the vase. We can do that by controlling this angle property right here. So as I rotate this around, check out that look that we can create on the vase without actually having to model that detail. I'm going to switch this out to a vertical line normal. That's actually the one that I use in the image. But again, it accomplishes a similar result, and you can easily control that angle. So that's pretty cool, considering we didn't have to model this level of detail, and how quickly you can customize and modify the look of this. Okay, next we'll move on to applying a material to the plate here. And again, I'll just create this from scratch, so I'll double click on the plate. And as I was setting up this scene, you know, I was working with different material types, and I found that metallic paint actually gave me a pretty cool look. So I'm going to set this to metallic paint. Now, for those of you who have never seen the metallic paint before, it works off of two colors. You have a base color and you have a metal color. The base is the overall color of the material, and the metal is actually going to show through where direct light sources hit it and reflect back to the camera. So if I increase this metal coverage, what that'll do is that'll actually increase the influence of this metal color here. If I switch this over to something like yellow or orange, you'll see that more apparently on this plate. But really what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a slightly gray color for the base, and just a white color for the metal color. Now again, you can see over here, this is a perfectly reflective surface. You know, if your plate is perfectly reflective, then, you know, that's fine. By all means, keep it. In this instance, I think I'll go ahead and just add a subtle level of roughness to sort of break that up a bit. And there we are. Okay, so I saved the orange for last. The orange is actually going to use one of our newer material types, and that is the translucent material. And so I'll double click on that, and I'll change this material type from advanced to translucent. And I do have a texture that I already created for this, and let me go ahead and pull that up in Photoshop so you can see sort of the steps that I went through to create this. Okay, so, oops. And what I did is I actually got a real orange and peeled it and scanned that and used this as reference to actually create the orange texture. Okay, I'll show you real quick how the texture was created. If I open up the orange texture, this is what I created from this original scanned texture source. Okay, and how that was done is with that clone tool that we used when we created our seamless textures. And so again, I've activated the clone tool, and if I click on an area here, remember that takes a picture of the pixels underneath this circle here. It essentially captures them, and wherever I move this, as soon as I left click again, I start to paint those pixels in that area. And you can actually see a crosshair where I sampled the pictures are that indicates what area of the image that you're taking a picture of and replicating. So using this technique, I was essentially able to make a high-res color map of that orange, and based off of this texture, I created a bump map using the same techniques that I showed you earlier. Okay, so let's go ahead and load that onto the orange. Now, there's one important thing to take into account when applying textures to translucent materials, and they're quite a bit different than any other material in KeyShot. And what that is that this diffuse color here under the material parameters is actually blended and multiplied with your texture color. So essentially I have that orange texture being overlaid on top of a blue color. Those are mixing, so I get this bad looking orange here. If you want the true texture or the true color of your texture to show through, what you want to do is set this diffuse color to white. That will give you the true look of whatever texture you created. Okay, now with translucent materials, essentially what happens is light hits the surface of this, it's scattered around underneath, and is then sent out back to the eye. Where that's actually seen in the real world, you'll see it with a lot of soft-looking plastics. You'll see it in basically anything organic, anything from human skin to fruits, vegetables, meats, plants, you name it. One thing that we've all seen that really is a good example of translucency is if you've ever seen somebody standing in front of the sun and you see their ear, you can see sort of the blood vessels and the light passing through their ear. That's what translucency is. Now there's a difference between translucency, what we have here, and transparency, what we have over here. Essentially, for those of you that are designers, I know most of the time you're not going to be doing oranges, gray, human skin, things like that. But where this is really useful is when you are doing realistic plastics, because almost all plastics have some level of translucency to them. You know, look for things like Sharpie pen caps. Hold it, you know, up in front of a light, and if you see, you know, some light scattering underneath there, perfect example of the type of plastic that you want to use the translucent material to recreate. Okay, now the transmission color here, this is essentially the color of the light that's scattered beneath the surface of the material. Now 9 times out of 10, what you're going to want to do is just use a lighter color of whatever your diffuse color is. And in this case, since I do have a texture applied, I just want to use a lighter color of what that texture is. And I can increase the amount of light scattering by increasing this translucency slider. Okay, so that will make that material even more translucent. Now let's zoom in here and we'll go ahead and add a bump map to get that higher level of detail. And also, like I said, we'll be providing this scene and material as reference for you later on. This orange material was actually set up to work for spherical maps, so you don't necessarily have to have an orange modeled. If you have a sphere and you load it in, you apply this material, and it should map on top of your sphere. Okay, so I'll double-click this material, and we're going to add a bump map to it. Actually, I created a normal map, so we'll go ahead and use that. And as you know, with normal maps, what we have to do is check that normal map box, and that converts it to normal map mode. I'm also going to add a bit of roughness to this. And we'll let that res up for a second so you can sort of see what's going on. This here is from the normal map intensity being too intense, so I can drop that back. Because essentially what's happening there, as I mentioned with normal maps, it does have XYZ coordinates to define these areas of raised and lowered. So essentially when you get these black areas, these are almost 90-degree angles. Okay, now one other thing is we are getting this really bright area here, so I'll go ahead and drop the intensity of the texture, and that will make that area not so bright when it actually reses up. That is found under the Texture tab, and you can apply that to any material that you create, be it translucent, diffuse, whatever. Anything you have a texture applied to, you can control the intensity of the texture. So if you have a texture applied to something and areas are blown out, like this right here, you can offset that by dropping the texture intensity. And again, since KeyShot's so interactive, it makes this a pretty easy and simple task to accomplish. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this scene out, and then what I'll do is I'll set up some more interesting lighting on here. So I'll save this as still life. And we'll go ahead and load it in this environment that, as I mentioned, we will be providing you with at the end of this webinar. So I went and dragged and dropped that into the scene. If you hover over, it'll say set environment image. As soon as you let go, it'll load your environment image. Okay, so that switched up our lighting environment. Now, one thing you can do, obviously this is incredibly dark, so if I press the up arrows, that's going to start to brighten up this scene. Okay. Now, we do have a nice level of lighting, but you'll notice that the wood is now a bit blown out. So again, remember that trick that I showed you with the textures? If you double click on this material, that pulls up the properties, and I can start to drop the intensity of this wood texture to bring it down to something that's not so blown out. Okay. Now, we do have some decent lighting set up. We've got our materials tuned, but you can see, since we just have the environment image back here, this doesn't quite work for our final image. So, either we need to hide the environment, and you can do so by clicking on the options box, going to the environment tab and unchecking show environment. At that point, you can actually set any color you want for the background color, or we need to load in a backplate. I mentioned that I'll go ahead and show you a technique for creating your own backplates off of HDRIs. Okay, so what I'll do first, so I'll go ahead and hide this model. And I did that by going to the scene tree under the options box. This shows my model, and if I uncheck this box, that automatically hides it. By the way, you can also hide individual parts of a model by clicking this arrow that unfolds your hierarchy, and you can hide parts individually. Okay, so to create a backplate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a section of the HDRI that has a nice, tonal range, a nice range of darks and lights. And what I'm going to do is turn on depth of field in the camera tab. So I'll go to options, camera, and enable depth of field. Now, for those of you who are familiar with photography, or for those of you who are not, what depth of field is essentially when you have a camera focusing on a certain area, and maybe the background is blurred. That's what depth of field is. So we can pick our focus point, and we can actually control the level of blur within our scene by lowering this f-stop here. The lower the value, the more blur you're going to get on your depth of field. So as I bring this down, this background starts to become sort of abstract and sort of blurred, but it does so in such a way that it actually simulates what a camera does when it's focused on something in the foreground and the background is blurred. And it's a common technique in photography when you are photographing something to actually blur out the background so that the focus is on whatever it is that you're photographing. Now the great thing is about this is it'll also happen very fast, since we're not actually blurring the model. All we're doing is blurring this background environment. So once this has reached an acceptable level of quality, you can either save out a screenshot, or you can go ahead and press render, and it will render out whatever size backplate that you need. Now, this does actually simulate a real lens effect. You can see we're starting to get these shapes here. This is quite a bit different than just a standard blur, and I'll show you just very quickly what the difference is. Okay, so here's one that I already set up ahead of time. This is a backplate that I created from an HDRI. There's no depth of field here. This one actually does have depth of field, and you can see these little circular shapes here. This is the actual effect that you get when you have depth of field on a real camera lens. So KeyShot does calculate real depth of field. Now let's look at this compared to if we just apply a slight blur. So if I go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and increase this, let's take a look at the difference between these two. So here's just a Photoshop version, and here's actual calculated 3D depth of field. So you do get, quite a bit more interesting and realistic look, especially if you are trying to convey depth of field. All right, so I'll go ahead and bring my model back, and I'll load in that backplate that I had already previously set. And I can turn off depth of field. It's another great thing. Since the depth of field is already calculated on that backplate image, I don't have to calculate that, and that will improve render time. Okay, so that loads in this backplate. Now I can sort of position this within there, and I'll adjust my real-time window so that it fits. Okay. So there we go. So there we have a nice backplate for this particular scene here. Now, this brings us to the part in the webinar where we talk about actually improving the dynamic range of our image. Let's take a look at what we got going on here with this current setup. You can see, like, if you look at this plate area here, this is quite blown out. If we look at the specular highlights on the metal, that's blown out. There's not a whole lot of detail in there. I mean, even here, if you look at the spoon and the plate, this is really sort of blending together, and we're losing some detail there. Okay, so this does involve a little bit of work in Photoshop if you have textures applied, and I'll go ahead and walk you through what that is. And also, I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar that improving this dynamic range relies on its gamma property. You'll see it in two places inside KeyShot. You'll see it under the Environment tab, and you'll see it under the Real-Time tab. Without getting too technical on what gamma is, you can think of it as a fancy word for contrast. And basically, a lower value will have more contrast, and a higher value will have less contrast. So you can control that on your environment, although we highly recommend just leaving this value at a value of 1. What we're going to be altering is the real-time gamma to help improve our dynamic range. It is a very sensitive setting, so subtle changes in value will have a big impact on it. And what it does is it also controls the fall off of light. So to get a natural fall off of light, what we want to do is we want to set this to a value of around 2.2. Okay, so what that did is that kind of washed out the scene there. But if I drop the environment brightness by using my arrow keys, look at how much detail we're now retaining in these specular highlights on the metals. And we're going to fix these textures inside Photoshop so that they still retain that level of pop and contrast that they had before we did this. Also, if you have a backplate applied, you may want to uncheck Adjust Brightness under the Backplate tab, because any adjustment that you make as far as brightness or gamma under the Real-Time tab will actually affect your backplate. And in this case, that's not a desired result. Okay, so let's fix this wood texture so that it still has that level of visual appeal to it that we had before. So I'll open that up. And here is Wood Seamless that we already created. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a copy of that so we don't alter our original version. And I did so by clicking on the layer and then dragging and dropping it over the New Layer button. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to the Image menu, and remember we are inside Photoshop now. And I'll go over to the Exposure tab. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the gamma correction to 0.4545. What that does is that severely darkens the image, and it doesn't quite look right for us now, but trust me, once you get over into KeyShot, it'll be perfect. So let's save this out, and we'll call this Wood Seamless Gamma Correct. And we're also going to do that for that orange material that we had saved out. So again, this gamma, by default, this image has a value of 1 on the gamma, and we want to drop it to 0.4545. And this is to achieve a natural fall off of light look in your render. So 0.4545, and again, looks pretty horrendous here in Photoshop, but when we pull it into KeyShot, it'll look nice. So I'll save this out as orange gamma correct. And let's replace those textures in the scene. So I double-clicked on the wood material, and you can see how washed out it looks right now. I'll go ahead and load in our gamma-corrected wood. And that's quite a bit better. Now also we had turned down the intensity previously. We can bring this back up now. Okay, and let's swap out our orange color map. So I'll switch this to orange gamma correct. And I can also go ahead and bring back up the intensity of this texture. So let's go ahead and let this sit for a second, and while that reses up, this pretty much concludes what we're going to cover in the webinar today. I will let this res up so you can see the look of the scene as it clears up and becomes high quality. But I'll go ahead and open it up for question and answer period. So go ahead and fire away, and we'll go ahead and answer the questions for you. Oh, and also, we are recording this webinar, and so we will post this under the forum. So if we go to KeyShot.com and we go to the forum, there is a webinar section under here, and we'll go ahead and post this along with the scene and environment image for you guys, so you can go ahead and have that. The question is real-time Gamma 2.2 a good starting point for most renders? Doesn't KeyShot default to Gamma 1.0? And yes, KeyShot does default to Gamma 1.0, and the reason is because images that people take are loaded in at Gamma 1.0. Most people don't do Gamma correction, so that essentially helps give their images a non-washed out look when they load it into KeyShot. So that's why it's not really set to 2.2 by default, because images have gamma of 1. Okay, doesn't seem to be too many questions here. So I hope this webinar was useful. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of how to create your own textures, how to improve your dynamic range, and overall just more efficient ways of working inside KeyShot. As I mentioned, if anything does come up later on and you have any questions, you're always welcome to contact us at support@lexion.com. We're always here to help you with your projects, and anytime you get hung up or want to know how to do something, we're happy to help. Also, if you have any suggestions for webinars, we do these for you guys to help make your lives as designers easier. If there's something you want to know, please send us an email to info@lexion.com, and we'll be happy to do a webinar on any subject that you would like to see covered. So thank you for attending, and like I said, you can go ahead and check the forum later on, and we'll post this webinar along with the scene, materials, and new environment images for you guys to use. Thank you for attending.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, web events made easy.